So thank you, Sheila, for introducing me. I am Director of Member Data Sales at CAQH. I've actually been at the company from the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, and have been marketing and selling COB Smart since I started. So I've worked with quite a few, or maybe a few of the payers here during your evaluation and management and budget approval phase and contracting and getting you through implementation and then having a successful go live. So I've seen a lot of payers go through this process, and I'm excited to talk about our data validation service, which we, actually, next slide, which we launched in 2020. And I'm going to give an overview of this, of kind of data validation, why we decided to launch the service, as well as some of the results that we have seen aggregately with our health plans that are on data validation, as well as some data on those that are not participating. So there's a saying that goes, when you've seen one health plan, you've seen one health plan. No two health plans are the same, and that is definitely true for the data that we receive in COB Smart. What I mean by that is that some health plans will send us data from their data warehouse. Some will send us data from their source of truth, their membership or enrollment system. Some are sending us information from their eligibility files or from a Section 111 file. So the data is kind of a disparate source of information that we're getting from a variety of payers. So it may not be always timely and current. So what we end up processing in the COB Smart database may be very current information from some payers, and some information might be a little out of date. This can cause some issues with the quality of the data that we are returning back to each participating plan. Then you add some issues, with COVID. There was a kind of wider variation in coverage and claims data because of employer and coverage volatility over that 12 to 24-month period. So we are happy that we instituted data validation because it allows us to perform an eligibility double check that will clearly identify if a member has an active or inactive policy. We've also mentioned today that validation enables correct payments if we validate that there is secondary coverage. It also mitigates corrections after the fact and reduces administrative work like manual validation of an overlap. Data validation is our step to improve the quality and accuracy of the data we are sharing between payers, but more importantly, it is also a step for each plan to flag members that may need to be termed out of their file, so we are not billing you on a per member per month basis on those members, and those members do need to be removed. But we feel that the better quality data that we're sending you, you will then be able to automate and auto-load that data. So I wanted to give our customers that launched, we wanted to give our customers that launched COB Smart before 2020 some time to adopt data validation. So as a result, we don't have every single payer that's participating that's using the service. But of the 220 plus million members represented by about 49 payers, we have over 163 million that are going through the data validation process. Our goal is to get to 100% of all of our medical and now pharmacy members through that validation step. So that is our goal. So I want to go through some results we've seen since we launched data validation. Some of you may not know what an O4 determined overlap is. These are overlaps where our algorithm has been able to determine primacy based on the data we've received from each payer. Once we validate that O4 overlap and the member is showing active by each payer, then each payer can flag that member as having current secondary coverage. In the table on the left, we've identified that plans of a certain size or membership are averaging anywhere between 1,000 to 18,000 validated determined overlaps on a weekly basis, where they can then flag those members that have other coverage. We've also been able to, in about over 101,000 incorrect records we've noted, we've been able to delete those, and about over 1.7 million incorrect termination dates, we've been able to override them. And about 26% of the overlaps had members that were inactive, so those members will be then flagged to be termed. All of these results have led to health plans with data validation seeing a gradual increase in their determined primacy and a gradual decrease in undetermined primacy over time. So we really kind of look at that as the key metric to be following after you go live with data validation, kind of seeing that as you clean up your file, you'll see those changes in your determined and undetermined primacy. And for actually plans that are not participating in data validation, the determined and undetermined primacy rates have pretty much stayed the same over the same period of time. So they're seeing a higher a percentage of undetermined primacy rates versus determined primacy rates. So it's a clear distinction between those that are on data validation and those that are not. In addition, there's one particular primacy code, an undetermined primacy code, and what I mean by that is we found an overlap between two payers, but we couldn't determine who the primary payer was. That code is U004, it's the dreaded U004 code, which by definition is that a maximum of 2 plans exceeded, or we have an overlap between 3 or more payers. Now, how is that possible? Usually, they are actually not true tertiary coverages. There might be a few instances where they are, but usually there's some payer, and I'm not going to name any names, that didn't term a member, so that member is showing up as having multiple coverages. One of our favorite results from the payers or the plans that are participating in data validation is seeing that steady decline in that U004. So we're seeing some improvements, and they've been able to clean out that membership and eliminate those members that were termed, that needed to be termed. So that's a positive benefit of data validation. Unfortunately, those that are not on data validation, they're seeing a pretty steady state or steady rate of the U004 overlap, and I know that can be very troubling to plans. Lastly, I want to talk about retrovalidation. I know Rebecca brought it up earlier. It is an add-on service for those health plans that have data validation, and it allows current participating plans to validate overlaps identified at an earlier date or a date in the past that either was never validated or was not validated recently. Doing this eliminates the need to make phone calls to determine which past overlap can be used when processing current claims. Some use cases for retrovalidation, Rebecca might have mentioned this, but I'm going to mention it again, are if you wanted to validate overlaps a year in the past with all participating payers after you join data validation, or if you want to validate overlaps uncovered during open enrollment with participating payers in your geographic area. Another example would be to use it for validating overlaps a year in the past with just one payer who has just joined data validation, or if you wanted to check the accuracy of your data during an audit. It is this retrospective validation service is flexible and customizable, and there's essentially a few steps involved to process that information. And if anyone wants more information about it, we'd be happy to share that with you, and hopefully we can get some people on the retrospective validation service. And I will hand it now over to Ted.
It's a little bit of a tightrope here, walking over. Clicker here. All right, Ted Pallas. I'm the Director of Financial Payment and Review at Medical Mutual of Ohio, based out of Cleveland. So a lot of people ask me, like, what is financial payment and review, right? Because it doesn't say payment integrity, it doesn't say disbursements, it doesn't say coordination of benefits. I'm all three combined. So my team handles all of our claims audits, both pre and post pay, coordination with all of the payment integrity vendors. And then I have a set team that handles all of our COB research, primarily with commercial payers. And then a third team that handles all of our financial disbursements and our 835 remittance advices over to our providers. So obviously I have a little bit of a different spin when it comes to COB Smart and to coordination of benefits overall, and the way that we use data validation. So Medical Mutual, we've been around for quite a while, founded in 1934, and as I mentioned before, based in the state of Ohio. We brought on COB Smart in 2019 initially, and then we added data validation in 2020. And I'll go into that a little bit further. one of the things that I look at is how coordination of benefits plugs into payment integrity overall. When people ask me to kind of split out my teams, I tend to lump it more with our payment integrity and less with kind of the operational aspects. And the reason for that is to me, payment integrity means paying right the first time, in all of the work that comes ahead of it. Coordination of benefits is so important in paying right the first time. Everyone's talking about, our return on investment, savings, and it's easy to sit back on COB and in other payment integrity programs and say, look, this is what I am doing, this is what I am saving. But truly, coordination of benefits goes both ways. At the end of the day, I look at it as a net zero proposition. But here's the thing, you're taking the member out of the middle. You're not getting them caught up in who's responsible for paying the provider. CAQH helps us to do it proactively, which is why we brought on COB Smart, as I mentioned, in 2019. But the thing that we found with COB Smart is that it's as good as the data that we're putting into it. Ultimately, JJ touched on the fact that oftentimes we're feeding data into COB Smart out of either our membership systems or out of our electronic data repository, which is fed by our membership systems. The thing that I know is the most difficult is, number one, we're primarily a commercial health plan working with employer groups. You get updates from employer groups last minute, sometimes after the last minute, quite often. So you're making retroactive changes to eligibility. Additionally, you have one human being and you're trying to track that human being across multiple segments of coverage. And what I mean by that is someone can change groups. They can move under their spouse's plan and have a completely separate identification number associated with the policy. There's a lot of difficulty in trying to track that human being across those segments. And the reason I bring this all up is because we all have similar hardships, right? It's hard to say one plan is submitting this when I can't tell you at 100% that I'm always submitting everything 100% accurately. And that's really where data validation has come in. At the end of the day, when that data comes through incorrectly, prior to data validation, our teams were reaching out to the other health plans, and I'm sure you've all lived this, either through the CAQH portal or physically picking up the telephone and calling. And when we brought on data validation in 2020, I kind of quickly realized it's about half of the product. I'm not going to lie to anyone in this room. It's almost half of the product, and it's a fraction of the cost at the end of the day. And that's not a sales pitch. But at the end of the day, it helps us to not only get that overlap from CAQH, COB Smart, but also to find out that coverage is still active. And that flag that the coverage is still active tells us that it's a legitimate record. We still run into issues, and I'll go into that in the next slide, but at the end of the day, those issues are a fraction of what we were researching previously. At the end of the day, I mentioned at kind of the top of the discussion, our coordination of benefits team is really about reducing administrative cost. Administrative cost for us in researching, administrative cost for our providers in trying to determine who they should be submitting to. It allows us to proactively identify those other carriers to our providers as well so that we can share information. And that's really what I love most about CAQH is it's kind of an arena for us to share our enrollment information and identify those overlaps. For those other payers that are involved in the commercial space, one of the most difficult things is when you find out that there's coordinating benefits that you should have been paying primary to that you weren't aware of. And you find out, of course, that other carrier, unbeknownst to you, paid primary on a claim. Often we find it with payers of last resort, right? Medicaid plans. that are trying to pay timely to those providers, and they don't know that the commercial coverage exists. And we'll find out 3-4 years after the fact, and we have to go back to an employer group and tell them that they may be responsible for covering a claim that they didn't know existed 3 years ago. Data validation is a terrific tool in that arena, and obviously we offer up our enrollment within that marketplace, and would love for others to come and take a look at it ultimately, because it's an accuracy proposition. So moving on to some of the best practices and the lessons learned. At the end of the day, I mentioned the efficiency gains. That active status, when we pull it, when we go into CAQH, COB Smart, and we see that green flag, that active flag that's generated by the data validation, we know that it's a legitimate record. Unfortunately, it's not always perfect, right? Because that active record could still be flagged for a Medicaid plan, or perhaps a Medicare Advantage plan where we have an employer group that's greater than 20, right? So, there's still additional work to be done, but sometimes it can also tip us off to the fact that we've submitted information inaccurately over to CAQH and COB Smart. And we've used it for that purposes and identified membership file issues in the past. So that's the main thing that we've learned, right? Is always use that information reflectively. The other thing that I didn't mention too is when I came over into this team, and I have a financial and accounting background, the team was a little bit in the dark ages, and I'm happy to say that we've been working to migrate away from that. When I say the dark ages, right, I'm talking about actual COB questionnaires and pursue and pay methodology. We've been working to shift away from that methodology, right? We obviously moved on to COB Smart. Our number was about 42,000. I know when UPMC was speaking earlier, she mentioned that they were at around 90,000. 42,000 was our first file. And we have saved over $3 million, but I think more importantly, and that's in retrospective recoveries. Those are very easy to measure. But more importantly, we know that we've shown that enrollment information, and we've allowed faster payment for other payers as well, which has stopped that back-end recovery from Medical Mutual. And at the end of the day, it allows us to offer a better product to our employer groups. But in taking a look, you can kind of see we're shifting, as we shift away from our questionnaire process, the number of records that are overlapping on our monthly file continues to drop. So you can see, look, we have about 2,917 that had originally notified us through that questionnaire process, which was originally a much higher percentage, and now about 12,590 have shifted out, which means that we're moving more towards real-time updates through the portal. And that overlap number should continue to get smaller because we're not sending those questionnaires any longer and requiring that our members move away from those. So that trend started in about 2020, early 2020, and we continue to see it improve, which for us is a confirmation that our investment in COB Smart and the subsequent investment in data validation is working. So that's the end, and I know that I typically fly through slides. So I want to make sure that obviously I leave time for any questions you may have.
Could you go over that last slide again, what those, I'm not sure that I caught.
Okay. Oh, no, this is the size of our monthly enrollment file, all right? So Medical Mutual, we're about 1.5 million members, right in that ballpark. And on a monthly basis, we send a change file over. And we have members that move between enrollment sections that we mentioned. We have members that may move between employer groups. So this is the last enrollment file that was generated on 8/15. And what you can see is that enrollment file then identifies coverage overlaps for those members. And what this is the total number of COB questionnaire generated responses that we had prior to the launch of CAQH COB Smart. And the number, that 2917, continues to drop because of the fact that we've moved away from those questionnaires for detection. So you can see the majority of our COB we're identifying through CAQH at this point in time, not those letters that we had stopped several years ago.
Are you still sending letters?
So we still are, only at the request of self-funded groups right now. So that's one of the things that I'm sure a lot of other commercial payers have gone through. We're trying to actually discourage the use of those letters. Obviously, our providers don't love them. And number two, member response to those letters is poor. And in any customer experience survey that we send out, those letters will be brought up if that specific group is sending them out. I can almost guarantee.
Are you sending out for those groups like a yearly canvas, or is it via a claim that comes in where you're looking for something?
So typically, we try to send those no often than once every 2 years. Yeah, so when we moved away in 2019, we tried to shift off of the claims-based letters. Because oftentimes those claims, you don't want to hold them up to send a letter. Again, it does more harm than good.
An actual canvas they know it's for.
Correct.
Like, when you send out those questionnaires, do you hold any subsequent claims until the response is received back from the member?
That's exactly what we've moved away from.
Okay. So,
That's a great question, but that is exactly what we've tried to shift away from.
so when you send out a questionnaire, there's really no bite to it, meaning that if the member doesn't respond, you're just going to continue and process their claims.
Absolutely, yeah. At this point, that's what we've offered up as our primary option.
Okay. No, the reason I'm asking, we use obviously COB Smart and also data validation. Our plan is probably 3 times the size as far as enrollment is concerned. And we're really old school. We send out those questionnaire, and any subsequent claims that come in, we deny all those claims.
Yep.
But you know what happens then? The EOB goes to the member, he or she is pissed off. They call, and then what do? We go in and adjust all the claims. So we wind up, I think like last year, we denied, God, I think it was almost 1 million claims. And then we actually adjusted, 980,000 of them. So
Yes.
certainly we're changing that process, but I was just interested to see what you guys are doing.
No, that's a terrific question. So my other hat, which is primarily my financial payment, which is our disbursement operations, and all of our subsequent 835s that align with those financial disbursements. What we've identified through collaborating with some of our providers is that they will measure the difference between our initial denials and our final denials, and they hold that as a metric in terms of payer performance. So within the state of Ohio, there's something called the Ohio Hospital Association, and all of the provider systems will report their statistics over to the Ohio Hospital Association. And what we identified is that it can make you a little bit of an outlier in terms of that initial denial rate. And again, we saw right around an 85 to 90% overturn rate on those denials when we did our analysis. And what that drives is not only rework on our side, but it drives rework on the provider system side, because they may be submitting that claim 2-3 times. It's coming through, and then as soon as we receive the response, we've got to go through and update all of those back claims. And like you said, you end up with those escalations, because at the end of the day, as soon as that member hits a high dollar claim, they're calling you. They may not call you on the smaller professional claims, but as soon as that high dollar claim hits, they're on the phone. They're not just with your customer experience team, they're on the phone with their employer group complaining about the methodology. So those are great questions.
I was curious if you could explain in greater detail your organization. It seems to be set up a little bit differently than a traditional claims environment for COB.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, I have kind of four main functionalities. We have, number one, within my organization, I have our financial disbursements. I have all of our clinical validation auditing. I have all of our quality auditing, which is essentially adjudication quality, right? Reviewing your claims, making sure that you've adjudicated them accurately corresponding to the contract. And obviously, we're going to focus on high dollar claims. We don't want to underpay or incorrectly pay high dollar claims. And then our coordination of benefits. Our organization is a little bit different, and I report up through our customer experience team and our operations. But my background, again, is in finance and accounting. I've been with Medical Mutual for about 16 years, started off as a staff accountant. So, no problem. Any other questions?
I have one more question, Ted. Have you done anything with automation with regards to the 270, 271 process with the data validation?
So we have not yet reached the point where we've 100% automated, right? One of the things I know was talked about earlier today was artificial intelligence and robotic process automation. I think as we continue to refine that data, at some point, we are going to engage our RPA team, which our robotic process automation team, to start making those updates to our system. Obviously, that's the fastest and most efficient way to get the information there.
We're actually working on a project now to actually automate the updates into our COB file based on positive determinations by CAQH. And then in addition to that, part of that same process is to really look at our claims history, identify any claims that were incorrectly paid as primary wouldn't be secondary, and automatically recoup those claims. Very complicated process. And I will tell you, even with data validation, what we find, which I think is kind of the theme that was said before, not every payer is the same.
Yep.
Right? Some are better than others as far as the accuracy. And while we are moving towards an automated approach, we're not doing that with every payer. Right? We've identified, I think, 4 payers that we kind of trust.
Yep.
Right? And that's how we're going to start. So
Yep.
I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.